Wonderful. Let me start by the obvious apology. It's a real pity I can't be with you in person. And the reason, if you wish, is the family, because my wife would be very vulnerable were I to catch the virus. And I thought this is just a risk I can't possibly take. Let me now share my screen for the presentation. And I hope it works as desired. So we all day have been talking about families, but we haven't seen any. So let me start with a Dutch interpretation of family life, which hopefully illustrates the theme of my presentation. United, but certainly not uniform. Of course, I am not here to show you pictures, but to show you science. So I will use experimental evidence about one specific aspect of family life, namely risk-taking. The motto comes from Laudato Si, i.e. from our Pope. The Pope wrote in the encyclical, "In the family, we first learn how to show love and respect for life. We are taught the proper use of things, order and cleanliness, respect for the local ecosystem, and care for all creatures. In the family, we receive an integral education which enables us to grow harmoniously in personal maturity." I read that as an empirical claim. Family has a formative influence. This influence could come on two channels. For everybody, it can come through enculturation. And for the kids, that's it. For the parents, there's an additional option, which is selective mating. They might have found together because they want to be together, because they think they are for each other. This claim has two corollaries, and this is on what I will be focusing in my presentation. The stronger claim is, since we are together in the family, we should converge to being very much the same. The second is a weaker one. There's no need for us to become the same in the family, but we know, to the extent that we are not the same, in which ways the others are different, and we pay deference to that. I will interpret both of these as hypotheses and try to test them. Behind today's presentation is a more technical paper with two colleagues who both originated in Russia, Alexandra Fedoretz and Olga Goroklina, but today I will try to keep the technicalities low. The method is an experiment. We had the great opportunity to run it on the intervention sample of the German socioeconomic panel, meaning we know much more about our participants than just that the data we generated. And we could cover all 494 households. We have 269 child pairs, so it's a paired experiment, 177 parent-parent pairs, and a few parent-child pairs. So my first hypothesis could be interpreted as there is alignment. Let me first say how we want to test the whole thing. The task is, all experiments are simple, so this one is deliberately also very simple. The task is, please choose 1 out of 11 options for a lottery. In each lottery, there's a 50% probability of a good and a 50% probability of a bad outcome. And if you choose lottery 0, then you get the same amount of money, 10 units, with certainty. And the red ones is what can happen in the worst of all cases, down to nothing in the last one. And the blue one is in the better of all cases. And there's an asymmetry which is deliberate. So you can gain much more by accepting risk. And the question is, are you happy to? So Graphs in quantitative presentations are, of course, another form of rhetoric. So let me first present you this slide, which on the x-axis has the choice the other family member has made, and on the y-axis, my own choice. And the main takeaway from this paper is it's all over the place. And if you look a bit more closely for my alignment claim, what I would have to find is that most of the choices are on the 45 degree line, and this is clearly not what's going on. So uniformity in a strict sense, everybody has the same preferences within a family, is definitely not what we find. However, I said graphs are a form of rhetoric, and you can represent the same data in a different way as a histogram. And now as the difference between my choice and the choice of the other family member. And now you see that at 0, so when our two choices are the same, actually we have the mode. Most participants are there, but it's not a terrible amount of them, it's 16%. But we also see that this is pyramid shape, and that implies that big differences are considerably less likely than small differences. So indeed, we do find a degree of alignment, but it's not very pronounced. Let me move on to my weaker hypothesis. We are different, but we know it, and we act in ways that resonate with our knowing that there is a difference. This is where my actual experimental manipulation comes in, because thus far it essentially was only descriptive, but now we have randomly exposed participants to 4 different conditions, and everybody had made choices for all 4, but for presentational purposes, I will go through them one by one. The first is one where a participant in the family pair A decides, and the effect of the decision is exclusively on a family member B. So the person is, as we in the jargon called it, a ruler. If you now look at the graph, I measure something different. So I measure the difference between this condition, I call it free respect, and the original decision that the participant has been taking when completely on their own. And here you see two messages in this little graph. The one is the mode at 0 is even more pronounced than it used to be previously, and now it has a different meaning. It means that almost 40% of the participants actually impose their own will on the other family member. So that's not respect, it's the opposite. But about 2/3 actually pay some respect to what the other family member wanted. But the second message of this graph is left and right to 0, the bars are not equal. We find many more bars to the left than to the right-hand side. And what is to the left-hand side, that's those who are erring on the cautious side. So who are exposing their other family member to less rather than to more risk than they would have taken themselves. The next condition was one which in experimental economics jargon would be a dictator game. One participant has decision power, but the decision affects not only this one participant, affects simultaneously the other participant. Now, we still have 30% who impose their will and 70% who change, though in that respect, it's surprisingly similar to the situation where it didn't matter at all for the individual, but what's gone away is the cautious shift, or actually, we do the stats, it's there, but it's much smaller. The third situation that we exposed participants to is a joint decision. Now, A and B have decision-making power, and actually the average choice between the two of them is implemented. And we see, looking at the histogram again, this matters. Now we have less participants who choose the same, make the same choice they have made on their own, but now we again find the cautious shift. And actually combining the first and the third condition and seeing that in these conditions, the cautious shift is relatively pronounced, suggests an interpretation, namely that if I carry responsibility for the well-being of another family member, I would rather not want to be responsible for this person getting a low outcome, and I'm less concerned about the risk that this person could have made more money and I'm responsible for this not happening. And of course, this is a joint decision-making situation. So now we can't exclude, and actually we expect that some of the decisions are not just driven by the fact that what I do matters for the other family member, but also driven by the fact that what I do matters for me, and that therefore some form of strategic interaction is going on. This is what we modify in the final condition, where we again have both participants make a choice, but the arrangement is that the less risk-prone decision is implemented, which effectively gives the more risk-averse participant in the family veto power. And that reduces the cautious shift, but we find also quite a bit of mass on the right-hand side of zero. So quite a few participants in this condition expose the community of both participants to higher, not to lower risk. And that's interesting in that it suggests a clear case of respect of participants who themselves are rather risk averse, know that the other participant is more risk loving. And when they actually have the power to decide for everybody because they know themselves to be more risk averse, then they think, oh, well, I should go a bit into the direction of the other family member to show deference to their different interests. I know numbers in presentations are terrible, but let me at least give you a glimpse into the machinery that in the background lets us get confidence. And I have lots of stars for those of you who know how to read a regression, so everything is nicely significant. So we first, what I highlighted here, show that there is alignment. So my preferences are in relation to the preferences of the other family member, but this relationship is a weak one. So were it one, it would be complete, and it's 0.12. So there is a weak relationship of that kind. And I thought I had more highlights, so let me do it without highlights. So there is the first 4 lines that all give me significant negative effects. That shows that whatever condition I put participants in, there is this cautious shift, because the negative sign means they move away from higher risk exposure. And finally, I have 4 below the yellow line. That's the 4 interaction effects for those of you who know how to read a regression. And the interesting message here is they are not only all significant, they're all positive. And that implies that the sensitivity towards the different risk preferences of my counterpart increases whenever I have some influence on the well-being of the other person. So essentially, these interaction effects are the most important statistical message I have in the paper, in that they show me that respect for different preferences of others in the family is something that matters for real. Oh, now I see my activations. They didn't work on the first one. Anyhow, So let me now go on to a few extensions. And the first one is still built on experimental manipulation. So here I can make a causal statement. From then on, I will have to be more cautious. So the first thing on which I can say something is knowledge. So we wondered when designing the experiment whether it would make a difference if in the first round, everybody has taken their own decision on their own method only for themselves. And then we expose them to those four conditions. And in half of our participants, before we did that, informed them explicitly about the choice the other family member had made when alone. And as you can see by, no statistics needed here, by simple eyeballing, they're indistinguishable. And not only the central tendency is the same, even the distribution is practically identical. So what this shows is that there is no need whatsoever for explicit information. Family members just know to which degree and in which ways the other family member is different. I'd forgotten to explain the mechanics behind the graph, so let me do that. So this is the condition where the one person who decides on behalf of the other, so that what I call free respect. And here I'm using just a different way of representing the histograph. It's just a histograph translated into a curve. I do so because this makes it easier to see differences between different conditions because I can overlay these curves. So the next part of the paper is largely motivated by the wonderful fact that Robert Putnam's paper was already there when I started writing mine. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why don't I try with my data to explore to which degree in my data I find similar effects. But let me, before I go into that part, still cover one thing I started out with. I showed you the two different channels that potentially might matter, namely selection versus enculturation. And to test that, I can compare the child-child and the parent-parent graphs. And again, by eyeballing, you see there's very little going on. And actually, statistically, I don't find a difference, which suggests that the dominant channel that creates this respect for each other in a family is not selection. It's not that pairs search out each other for being respectful. It's rather that when they live together, their living together makes them respectful. But now on to the parallels to Robert Putnam's paper. So first, as we have the socioeconomic panel, we have fairly rich demographic data for each individual participant. And we, among others, know both household income and personal income. And here I must say a bit more how to read those graphs. So you remember when I showed the same thing in the form of a histogram that at 0, this spike, that is participants who just do the same in the situation when they decide for the other person as compared then when they decide for themselves. If I get more mass, so if the level of my curve here is a bit higher, on the left-hand side, this suggests a cautious shift, and were I to find the opposite, it would suggest a risky shift. Now, if I look at household income, statistically, I find a very small effect. It's in the paper, but again, the main message is strikingly different from what we yesterday saw in the US. In Germany, the household that's really poor, €0 to €2,000 in the household, and that's the blue line, compared to the most wealthy households in the sample, makes a very small difference. We see a bit more of sensitivity at the higher end, so that's in line with Robert Putnam's data, but the effect is fairly small. And if we look at personal income, then we find a bit more, but it still remains a very small effect. Then I look at employment, and here I find a bit more between those who are, blue line is now unemployed, the dashed red line is irregular, so chiefly part-time, and the grayish line is regular. And here we find a dampening effect for reasons I have no good explanation for. It's even more pronounced in those who have irregular rather than regular work, and there is a bit of action going on with respect to getting more risk prone. More interesting, even after we have heard the US data yesterday, is Robert Putnam was using the education level as the main explanatory variable because it captures everything else. We discussed about that. And if you look at my graph, nothing. So in Germany, education level just does no work. Of course, there is a big difference in terms of the dependent variables. I'm not discussing the same things that Robert Putnam rightly exposed to us, but the logic behind or the explanation offered for this big divide in the US, I thought would have to work under German context as well. Is it a well-functioning family, yes or no? And it seems that in Germany, there is practically no difference. There is actually an expected gender effect. So women are more risk averse, we have heard that before, and they are much more sensitive towards others, in this case, sensitive towards the risk preferences of the counterpart. Let me conclude on the obvious question, what about religion? So what I have in the data set is a dummy variable, so a yes or no variable, whether a person is a church member or this is not the case. And interestingly, we find that those who are acknowledging themselves to be church members are even more selfish, in that the peak in the middle is more pronounced in them. So the big question that my paper addresses could also be couched in this formula: are we our families? And the bottom line is the direct formative effect is there, but rather small. The big effect, the very pronounced effect, is that within families, we pay respect to each other. And as a corollary, there's no need for telling us in which ways our other family members are different from us. We just know it. A further result is that enculturation is the much more important driver compared with selective mating. And at least as far as I could drill into them, demographic correlates seem to be rather important. So let me conclude on another picture from the Rijksmuseum, another family. On first looking at it, one may think, well, they are a bit more formal, but that's higher up on the social echelon. And if you look at the picture a bit more closely, you realize the same story. They're different, they know it, they care about each other. Thank you very much.